Next week, children in Scotland will return to school on a full-time basis after the summer holidays.
With many speculating, these schools will act as a blueprint for the rest of the UK, and a number of parents remain cautious about how safe it really is.
Well, Dr Ranj joins us now with everything you need to know. Now, Ranj, this is quite a sort of anxious time for a lot of parents, also a lot of children returning back to school. Is it safe or not? I mean, a lot of parents really do want their kids to go back to school, and I'm definitely in that category. But at the same time...
You'll be fine, I love you.
You'll be fine, love you. Let me know if it's safe when you get home. But at the same time, it is scary. You know, this is kind of weird getting into that new normal. Is there anything to be scared about, do you think?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say I completely empathise with parents and kids that are worried about going back. That's a completely normal reaction to have. But likewise, there's a lot of people that would like their children to go back to school. There's a lot of kids that would like to go back to school. And any advice that we give out has all been carefully thought through. And the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health actually agree with this as well. So, as you said, from this month, it's going to be Scotland going back. Next month, the rest of the nations are going to start to go back. Do we need to feel anxious? Let me try to allay people's fears a little bit. So I work in A&E, I work on the front line. I haven't seen a case of coronavirus in a child for months, which is fantastic news. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it just goes to show that children are actually very relatively under-affected by this. Less than 2% of cases are kids and young people. If they do get it, they tend to get a very mild illness. We had a very small number of children across the country that had this rare inflammatory syndrome that happened after they got coronavirus.
Right.
Fortunately, that was just a very small number of kids. The chances of dying from coronavirus as a child are very, very low, which is fantastic news.
Well, what's interesting, just picking up on what you said there, is that the children quite often aren't the primary spreaders, isn't it?
No, they're not. This is the thing.
So we've sort of been told that they are.
Yeah.
There's so much
That's
confusion,
the case for flu.
isn't there?
We've learnt a lot about coronavirus as we've gone through this pandemic. Remember, at the start, we actually released a lot of very extra cautious advice because we didn't really know much about it or how it was going to pan out. Now, worldwide, we saw this, that children don't tend to spread it around. They don't tend to pass it to each other. They don't tend to pass it to their families. In fact, it's probably adults that tend to spread it to each other.
Yeah.
And the other good news, I suppose, is that when they modelled closing of schools, it didn't really seem to have an impact on transmission, and we've seen that across the world as well. As some schools have reopened, there haven't been huge spikes or surges caused by it. So this is all good news.
All great news.
All great news. And also the other side of it is that actually charities like NSPCC have seen a rise in people contacting them with problems because of being in lockdown. So what we need to really understand is that actually some children are at risk if they're stuck indoors. And they do have other problems that are brought on by lockdown. And that's why we get to a point where the risks of lockdown actually start to outweigh the risks of coronavirus, and that's why we've got to think about getting kids back to school.
OK, so when they get to school, what sort of safety measures are going to be in place once they're there?
There's lots and lots of guidance that's been put in, and you can go to gov.uk and find out what's happening in various places, and it's got links to the various nations there as well. There's 4 conditions that have to be in all schools all the time. Firstly, if anyone is unwell or is in contact with someone that's unwell, you've got to minimise contact with that person. Secondly, making sure that kids clean their hands thoroughly and a bit more regularly. There's got to be good respiratory hygiene practice, we call it. So catch it, bin it, kill it, the whole, you know, if you cough or sneeze, do it into a tissue, throw it away, wash your hands. And there's got to be enhanced cleaning throughout schools as well. Those are the 4 conditions that have to be there all the time.
OK.
They're going to try, depending on the school's individual circumstances, physical distancing rules may be in place, but that's very individual according to the organisation.
It's so hard to police, sure.
This is the thing. So actually, children may not necessarily need to physically distance as much as adults do because they don't tend to spread it around. And finally, there will be some situations where you will have to wear personal protective equipment. But again, that's very specific situations. That's not going to be the norm.
Raj, explain the bubble scenario.
Yeah, so let's go a bit more into some of this detail. So rather than children having to physically distance, which is going to be really, really difficult.
Oh, that's what they're going to try and do,
isn't it?
Near on impossible.
What they're going to try and do is create bubbles. So it may be whole classes or year groups will bubble together so that they they don't necessarily have to physically distance from each other.
Right.
But if somebody becomes unwell, obviously that entire bubble may then have to isolate or stay at home.
OK.
So
they would do pretty much everything in that bubble. So they would eat lunch in that bubble.
They would... breaks would be staggered, I guess.
Yes,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and if there is an outbreak, obviously, measures will be put into place. You know, individual year groups may need to be isolated. We don't think this is going to happen, but potentially a whole school may need to be isolated, but we don't think that's going to happen.
Right, yeah.
Raj, just your take as a doctor, and I know you don't work in education, but your take as a doctor, do you think they're going about this in the right way and they're doing the right thing at the right time?
So, as I said, the Royal College of Paediatrics have been looking at this really closely since the start of the pandemic and looking at the situation across the world. And we knew that the advice we issued at the beginning was precautionary. And as we've seen with shielding, some children and older people have had to shield because they were thought to be at higher risk. And what we found out as we went along, actually they're not. We can afford to be a little bit relaxed with them and get them a bit more back to normality. We wouldn't be doing this unless it was safe enough for children to go to school. We have to remember also teacher safety is really important.
Of course.
Staff safety is really important. So they might actually have to exercise other precautions, but they can feel reassured that it's not the children that are going to be getting this and passing it around. And remember, we're in a very different situation than we were back in March.
Yeah,
so
very true.
things are looking a lot better.
Just one thing I wanted to touch on, sorry.
Go on, yeah.
And you kind of talked a little bit about it, but I wonder if you could elaborate slightly, is the impact on children's mental health that this has had with them being off.
This is really sad. So I've seen a rise in mental health presentations in kids and young people in A&E, and it's noticeable. We knew this was going to happen. Some kids actually found lockdown beneficial because they weren't being triggered by whatever their trigger was. Sometimes school was their trigger. But other young people have actually suffered because they haven't been able to access the services they would normally get, or there have been extra pressures put on them. We're seeing a rise in self-harm. We've sadly seen some suicide attempts. It's really shocking, and that's why we need to get these kids basically back to normal as quickly as possible. People don't necessarily see that, and we haven't even touched on the abuse risk as well. There are some children that are at increased risk of abuse. We know domestic abuse calls have gone up, and we think actually child abuse presentations will go up as well, sadly.
Oh, it worries me. That's been my worry throughout lockdown, to be honest with you. It really has. Well, thank you. You've made me feel a lot better. They're definitely going now, kids. Off you go. Uncle Ranj says yes.
I don't want to go. Dr. Ranj said yes.